Congress is taking steps to try to claw back more than $1 billion it had already approved for public broadcasting. This after President Donald Trump asked lawmakers to defund PBS and NPR stations claiming media bias. In June, the House of Representatives voted to eliminate the funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which in turn funds 1,500 TV and radio stations. That proposal now heads to the Senate. Longtime supporters of public media are signaling their concerns, like documentary filmmaker Ken Burns, who recently spoke to CBS News.
It is the Declaration of Independence applied to the communications world. It's a bottom-up. It's the largest network in the country. There's 330 stations. It mostly serves, and this is where the elimination of funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is so short-sighted. It mainly serves rural areas in which the PBS signal may be the only signal they get. They also have not only our Good Children's and primetime stuff, they have Classroom of the Air, continuing education, Homeland Security, crop reports, weather, emergency information. That we're going to take away. This seems foolhardy and seems misguided.
Joining me now is Katherine Maher, the CEO and president of NPR. Ms. Maher, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So help us to understand how important this funding is to public media and why people should actually care about these proposed cuts. A lot of folks may say, well, there's a lot of sources for news and entertainment and information right now.
Well, I think I'll take those as two separate questions, really. Why is it so important that public media receives funding? The reality is the vast majority of public dollars is attributed to public media or appropriated to public media goes directly to local stations such as yours, which means that when we want coverage, for example, of what's going on in your local community, what's going on around town, what's going on at the State House in times of emergency or disaster relief, these are the sorts of things that local stations provide, and without federal dollars to ensure that those journalists are able to continue to do their job, that broadcast towers are able to continue to operate, even in rural areas or areas with challenging topography or those that are often affected, say, by major storms, which of course in Florida is a continuous concern. This is the sort of thing that makes it very difficult if you don't have federal dollars to support that. In addition to that, the question of, well, why do we need public media when we have all these other sources of information? I think that it is important to recognize that there is a thriving market outside of public media, but the reality is also that that market continues to shrink for local news. And local news is the vast majority of what public media does and does so well. In fact, there are 20% of Americans that live today without any other source of local news in their community other than public media. And that number continues to grow as local media gets hollowed out across the nation. If you think in addition to that, it's often one of the only broadcast sources that is available on the ground when, say, disaster strikes. I hate to bring up a tragedy, but of course, in this recent flooding in Texas, our local stations based out of San Antonio, based out of Austin, have been first on the ground in order to be able to respond and have leveraged the work of the Texas newsroom, which is a collaboration of all Texas stations, to be able to ensure that that coverage is robust and meaningful, addresses national questions, but also is really serving the residents of Central Texas as they're responding. So that local news piece is really important. And then I'd also layer on, not everyone can afford the expense of being able to subscribe either to streaming services or to have a subscription to a published news source. And so as we look across the nation, where we have people who live in places that don't have great access to broadband television or broadband streaming services, they live in places where cell phone coverage maybe is not as robust as in our major cities, public media really provides an essential service for rural communities, for communities that are maybe living on the edge socioeconomically, but of course deserve the same access to information as citizens as everyone else across the country.
So, Ms. Maher, this is certainly not the first time when a president has disagreed with how Congress has appropriated federal dollars. And of course, this isn't the first time President Trump has also disagreed with how Congress has appropriated dollars. So if the president decides that, a certain program, spending money on a certain program is wasteful and unnecessary, and Congress agrees, with the president on that. What is the issue here?
Well, I think that there's a couple different issues at work here. When we talk about rescinding federal funds that have already been appropriated, the reality is that for the funding package that's currently under consideration, that's $1.1 billion or $550 million per year, because the total funding package that is currently being considered by Congress is a 2-year package for public media. So it's really not as much money as it sounds when you start to break it down in terms of serving the entire nation. What we're looking at is actually money that was appropriated 2 years ago by a different Congress under a different president, with the idea that that's a forward advance that allows for public media stations to be able to plan. So I referenced broadcast towers, for example. Stations have already invested in those towers in next generation warning system, which is a critical part of emergency response, including in Florida, in order to be able to serve the public that they serve. For that funding to be taken away when it is already part of budgeting and planning means that there's going to be real harm in terms of the outcome for those stations planning. But I think there's a broader piece here that I want to focus on, which is that if you look across the nation, consistently, public media polls as very popular with constituents. It polls as very popular with voters, with your average American. PBS is among the most trusted news media out there, certainly the most trusted in terms of television, and NPR is also one of the most trusted sources of information in the country. So what you see as you look across the country is actually a disconnect between what people want in terms of their local services, their local stations, and what the president's funding priorities are right now. And so what we're really asking Congress to do is to listen to their constituents in this moment and to think about the consequences for their constituents, whether it's tribal stations in South Dakota, whether it is people who live in the bush in Alaska and rely on the broadcasts of local media to ensure that when they're going out for the day, that they have good access to weather information, which is critically important in a state where that can be truly a matter of life or death, for example, but really also part of the cultural connectivity of our nation as well, whether it's thinking about the broadcasts, for example, our recent concerts for the 4th of July celebration. So all of these are pieces that the American public really depends on, relies on, appreciates, and that's what's at stake. And we're just asking Congress to remember that, as opposed to sort of this conversation around a particular whim relative to this moment in this administration.
Ms. Maher, for decades, we've been hearing, lawmakers complain that NPR is left-leaning and that public dollars shouldn't go to support an entity that has a bias one way or the other. One of your former senior editors also alleged liberal bias at NPR. Are these fair criticisms?
I think it is always important for any media organization to take on any criticism of bias and to examine it and to reflect on it, and then to think about what we do with it. That is not to say that it means that those criticisms themselves are necessarily fully grounded, for example. However, I think it is vital as a public station, a public broadcaster that serves the American public, that we're asking ourselves, are we serving the American public well? And are we trusted, or are we earning the trust of a representative audience of the American public? We recognize that people have different political views, they have different life experiences based on where they live in the country, different needs for their news. And I think it's an obligation of us at NPR to serve all of those needs, whether you're coming from a red state or a blue state, whether you live in a city or if you live in rural America. It's important for us to be able to make sure there's something in our broadcasting that is relevant to you. So absolutely, I am always looking at this. I believe that success is a condition that we achieve when we are trusted by the broad representative experience of Americans. And so that's something that we have prioritized under my leadership, is making sure that we're really taking a close look at that. Do I believe that we are politically biased or partisan in some sort of way? No, I do not. And I think it's important that that we say that very clearly. We do not favor a political party. That is not the job of a news organization. We are a nonpartisan media organization. And yet at the same time, we have to make sure that all of our programming, cultural, political, and otherwise, really does represent the full experience of the American electorate.
Ms. Maher, how does public media move forward if it loses these these federal dollars. This is a tough time for a lot of media outlets right now, as you know, a lot of us struggling to reach an audience when there's so many choices out there right now.
It is, and I think that many of the things that media organizations are facing in terms of audiences and business models are part of the reason why public media is so important, and it's so important to support public media with federal funds. I mentioned earlier the fact that 20% of Americans live without a local news source that is responsive to the communities that they live in. That is because the market cannot sustain or support, or will not sustain or support, local news. And yet we know local news is a net good. When I say that, what I mean is that places where local news exists, you actually have greater rates of trust among citizens with differing political views. You have greater rates of participation in the community, whether that's volunteerism or turning out for local elections. You have greater confidence in your local civic institutions, whether that is your town hall or whether that is your local school board, because you have more information about what people are doing in your community and what that means for your life. So from our perspective, supporting that is critically important, particularly in a time when the nation feels polarized and when other local sources of news are going away. Now, what does this mean for public media going forward? I mean, I think we need to be very real about the risks of defunding. I've seen estimates that say that dozens of stations, particularly on the radio side, could go out of business in the next year or 2 years if federal funding goes away. And I want to be really clear that those stations are stations in places I've already mentioned, stations like rural Alaska, stations in areas like the Dakotas, in Nebraska, in places that have enormous reach in terms of their just geography, rural areas, and not very heavily settled, but nonetheless, these are places where Americans live and where they need and want to access the news. From my perspective, that is a tragedy, not just for the ability of those folks to be able to have access to critical information about their communities and about the nation, but also for the rest of America to be able to hear directly from those places and those communities. A key piece of the public media network is that we report around the nation for the nation. We have 3,000 local journalists in public radio all around the country. And at the national level, we're always calling on those journalists to help us tell stories that we would miss if we were just another national media organization. So if we want to be able to hear from someone who's directly affected by news happening in the nation, we just pick up the phone and we know we can reach a local journalist who can tell that story from the perspective of the ground. That would go away if public media funding disappears. And so I really want people to understand that this has immediate and direct consequences and harm if this funding disappears. Of course, we will continue to work to be able to support public media in terms of our public interest commitment, in terms of our need to serve all Americans. But again, it will have consequences. We're already seeing those consequences in public television. Children's educational programming has already lost $30 million in funding. There is no way to make that up in the private market. And I want people to really understand that this will hurt everyone across the nation, rural communities, young children, young families. And this is something that is a net good that we as Americans really should stand up and support right now.
Ms. Maher, if I can end with this, about whether you're concerned about the future of media in general and this relationship with the White House. Just to name a few issues, for instance, the FCC investigating ABC, CBS, and NBC News, the Associated Press going to court after the Trump administration restricted some of its access in response to its decision not to rename the Gulf of Mexico as President Trump had decreed. Are you concerned? Are you optimistic about the future of media?
Well, I'm always optimistic about the spirit of the media because it is as American as it gets, right? Our rights to free speech, it's the First Amendment. It is the amendment and the right from which all of our other rights flow. And I know that that is such a core value of our nation. And I know that the journalists and the media organizations that do the work of that function of accountability, that fourth estate function of providing a vital service to our nation, will never give up on that work. And so I appreciate you. I appreciate everyone who does this work as a journalist in our nation. That said, I do think this is a concerning time relative to this administration's support of those rights. I think we've seen that in a number of reports around settlements for litigation. We've seen that in the way that the media itself has been a target and politicized for its reporting. I am deeply concerned about what that says relative to the commitment that we have as a country to this fundamental right, to this constitutional right. And as an organization that works in this space, as an independent member of the press, I know that NPR and I know that PBS have remained very committed to these values. It's part of why we've taken on the president's executive order with litigation that is about our First Amendment rights, does push back against accusations of viewpoint discrimination. This is a critical thing for, I think, all Americans to care about. It's a constitutional right, it's an American value, and it's something that we need to stand up for. Even when we disagree with reporting, even when we disagree with one another, this is foundational to who we are as a nation.
Ms. Maher, we thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. We've got more great content for you, from news to the arts to the environment. So be sure to like and subscribe to WGCU's YouTube channel and follow us on our social media platforms for the stories that matter to you.